All right, everyone, welcome to I.A.M.'s first webinar event. We are excited to have our first guest speaker to present for our webinar. Our webinar is all about education and informing people what clinical research is all about. And then we're bringing in experts to come in and just kind of voice their area of expertise and let people know, like, hey, what goes on behind the scenes and just to help educate the community. Now, I.A.M Research and Wellness Foundation. I'm the founder, executive director. It was founded based on the fact that we don't have clinical research in the area. So, I.A.M Research and Wellness Foundation, part of it, we are going to fill in that gap, and we're going to do it with our guest speaker right now. We're excited to have Catherine, and I'm going to allow her to take the floor, and I'm going to stop talking.
Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending what time you're watching this. My name is Catherine Jimenez, and my work focuses on organizational management and structural alignment within mission-driven environments. Today's session is not just about personal resilience strategies or self-care tactics. I want to talk more about those systems in organizations, specifically burnout and research STEM and youth serving organizations, since it's often treated as an individual performance issue. In my perspective, and I believe in reality, it is often a structural design issue, being that mission-driven teams usually operate under unique stress. You have to keep up with grant timelines, compliance complexity, emotional labor, and emotional and informal leadership burdens. And when governance and capacity design lag behind growth, even the most high-performing teams can begin to feel that pressure. In this session, we will walk through why burnout is often structural, where leadership systems break down, a practical framework to realign governance, workload, and authority. And the goal is to move from endurance-based leadership to design-based sustainability. So in the next slide, we'll talk about how to reframe this issue. So to reframe how we think about burnout. Burnout in STEM is often a structural issue, right? So we tend to blame individuals, not that are basically you're not doing your self-care, you're not managing stress well. But I think it's so important to keep in mind that in these clinical research environments, there's that unique pressure, right? There's that investment in outcomes, complex compliance, and true leadership requires literacy in what is going on and what impacts the individuals that are holding up that organization. Not just passion, but technical expertise. And then as an organizational management advisor, my goal is to translate governance and structural alignment principles into practical leadership strategies for teams where structure often lags behind that growth. So, being that, we already mentioned those pressures and stress that affect these organizations, especially in STEM research. For example, let's talk about grant cycles that usually you have the timelines, you have the urgency culture, and deadlines are usually a non-negotiable in funding, and especially when you have a budget and that funding is finite. Also, in compliance and complexity, adds it's important that we keep in mind that the communication burden on top of the actual research framework or the work that is required. So these matrix reporting structures create confusion about who makes decisions and who is accountable. And informal leadership overload happens when high performers take on responsibility without that extra compensation, without the extra authority. It's just kind of like, hey, this is what you have to do. And people take on extra stress. And when decision rights, role clarity, and workload capacity are misaligned, often that's when we see that performance becomes unsustainable. And then this is where structural alignment becomes critical. Now, going into what the structural alignment framework, I have four areas where organizational clarity directly impacts sustainability. First, I want to touch on the importance of role clarity and understanding the clear responsibilities and boundaries for each person or each individual position. When everyone understands their responsibility and boundaries. Second, there's the decision authority, right? There should be a clear process for who decides what and when, and reducing those bottlenecks. No matter what's going on, what the day is, what the deadline that we're facing, everyone should understand who to go to for those decisions. Third, we have capacity mapping, right? So it's creating that realistic assessment of what people can actually accomplish given their other commitments. And that can change day to day. And last but not least, we have feedback and accountability loops. It's important to have that regular mechanism to surface problems early and adjust the course. These aren't just soft skills, they're organizational design principles that prevent burnout at the system level. And we'll get more into more specific examples as we go through this presentation. So even in strong programs experience burnout because high performance teams often compensate for that structural gap that may exist. You may have heard of hero culture, which emerges when we rely on one individual to overcome system failures. Someone always steps up, but it's not sustainable. Um, this is where we often see overextension of high capacity leaders. And this happens because capable people get asked to do more and more until they can't handle anymore. Um, this is also really important to pay attention to because if organizations start to scale without governance sequencing, it means that programs are going to grow faster and their decision making structures won't support that pace. With youth and adult programs, it's important because when it feels like we need to add more participants, more individuals, and the governance, we're not keeping in mind who does what. Um, that's where burnout starts happening. Now let's go into that emotional labor that happens in mission-driven burnout, whether you're in a lab doing clinical research or you're on the front lines speaking with stakeholders. People personally identify with the outcomes and they feel that moral responsibility that is often beyond your job description. And that's where that struggle to set boundaries and, the mission resonates. So the structural problem then becomes a personal crisis. And this is where it's important to have things like weekly one-on-ones or bi-weekly meetings where individuals can express what they're struggling with, or even just a moment of, hey, this is how I feel about what's upcoming and things like that. Um, so with mission-driven teams, they need to have a stronger organizational design. And the mission, we know that the mission amplifies everything, the good, the bad. So in this moment, I would like to maybe take a moment to reflect. Where is your team relying on individual endurance instead of structural clarity? And that's something that's important to take into account for intervention and future planning or future proofing the organization from that burnout. Okay. Next, I would like to discuss designing sustainable leadership systems. And we'll transition from diagnosing the issue, which was burnout, and talking about how we can design sustainable leadership systems. So capacity is a leadership metric and leadership readiness. These are the organizational management frameworks that can strengthen clinical and STEM leadership execution. So governance sequencing is about creating a clear decision-making tier. For firstly, separate strategic decisions from operational ones. Long-term direction versus daily execution. And these require different information, different timelines, and often different decision makers. So this is where that one-on-one, that those meetings are important for everyone to voice what they're struggling with or what they're experiencing on a day-to-day that may be impacting their output. Um, and then secondly, we have it's important to reduce bottlenecks by distributing authority to appropriate levels. So not everything needs senior approval. This is where it's important to empower leaders with a decision-making responsibility and understanding that, hey, I have the ability to make this decision for the team and that I'm trusted with that impact or whatever outcome from my decision. Also, and thirdly, we will talk about what clear escalation pathways may look like and the importance of knowing when and how to elevate decisions. So this prevents both decision paralysis and unauthorized overreach. So from my research and from what I learned about clinical research, this is especially important because compliance requirements can make people afraid to make any decision without approval. So having it's important to have that clear understanding of what is expected, who to talk to, how often we're touching base on those deliverables and expectations and daily responsibilities. Sometimes they may change. And then now it's capacity as a leadership metric. So being that this needs capacity needs to be something that is central to the daily way that we're doing things in operations and clinical research. So it should not be an afterthought. So first, it's important to map the workload realistically, count the actual hours that individuals are going to work, not ideal hours. Include hours where there's going to be that administrative work, those emails, those meetings, and that usually don't appear in the job description. So, for example, if we have a 40-hour work week, how many of those hours are actually going to be counted towards that research work versus emails, meetings, or maybe driving from place to place and things like that, and also maybe even preparing for those meetings. Um, Second, it's important to avoid grant-driven overcommitment. So, yes, of course, funding and grant cycles require urgency at times, but it's important to that when you accept those grants without capacity analysis, this sets up your team for failure. For example, if you accept a grant that is that that's 2 years long and you know that every 3 months you have a quarter um, reporting and you're not preparing and you wait until 2 to 3 weeks to the end of that quarterly cycle, you're putting that undue stress on the team. Um, Whereas if you were to plan from the get-go, you have clearer outcome and less pressure when the time comes. And also this will make sure that you're impeding that failure for the team. Third, aligning staffing with program scope. So programs must match team capacity. So, or either reduce scope or increase staff. So it's really important to understand that um, just because you have maybe a senior clinical researcher and 2 interns, they're not going to be able to perform to the same capacity as a 5-person, maybe manager team or even individual contributor may. So it's important to basically find that middle ground to prevent the burnout. And this is where organizational management discipline prevents the most common STEM leadership mistake. Now, moving on to leadership readiness. Um, readiness is about, or it should be about structural competence in your team. Um, it's important to keep in mind that, yeah, there may be levels or a natural procession when it comes to leadership. Um, but with that in mind, it's important to understand also competence. So you're not just promoting an individual contributor to a manager level without them being ready just because it's the logical next step, but also understanding how that's going to impact responsibilities and capacity for that individual and also for the entire team and organization. Um, so with that in mind, it's important to understand what structural impact is. So leaders must understand how the systems work, not just their subject matter expertise. Leaders must also develop systems thinking. So it's important to move. So it's very similar, like move beyond the systems thinking and more of that organizational design, of that operational, of how it's basically like is how I'm spending my time impacting those deliverables or impacting the team? Is there a more efficient way that I can communicate to have clear outcomes and reduce that maybe any um, misunderstandings that may be happening? Um, so this is where the transition from individual contributor to leader happens. And it's important to embed that sustainability into that program design from the start. So it should be a principle, not an aspiration that you hope to achieve later. So it from my research, it sounds like in STEM, leaders are very well good at that technical training, but then all may skip on that organizational training that's also very crucial. This gap creates leaders who then are technically brilliant, but often then struggle with understanding the structure that's driving the system, that's driving the organization, that's driving the impact that that clinical research is actually supposed to be making. Now, I'm going to um, share a little bit about the structure um, reset that I usually use with my clients when it comes to resets and what I've seen work, especially with conducting that role audit. So we start with documenting what the actual versus intended responsibilities are. Do we also do the session flow mapping and track where decisions stall and get stuck, and understanding that capacity. So do leaders feel like they're doing a lot more work than what they're supposed to doing or what they're able to handle? And are they also feeling compensated appropriately for what they're doing? Um, and again, going back to like that actual workload versus available hours. So how much time am I spending um, sending emails and in meetings and preparing for presentation versus the actual direct hands-on work, whether it's in the STEM role or in that clinical research. And more importantly, too, whether it's your work one-on-one with clients. In phase two, we talk about alignment. So it's important to clarify authority by signing decision rights explicitly and rebalance that workload as appropriately as possible. Um, so we got to distribute those tasks and reduce commitments as best as possible. And so there's a clear understanding of everyone's expectation and establish that communication for regular check-ins. In phase three, it's all about stabilizing and building sustainable systems. So what I mean by that is for the long term, um, it's important to basically see whether that mission and vision is we're like if we're aligned with the vision and mission. Are the things that we're doing today or even in the next 90 days in alignment with the mission and vision or in alignment with the grant requirements and deliverables? If they're not, this is where we have to pause and basically reset and stabilize. So first we have to define what are those sustainability metrics? What indicates that we're doing well and we're on track versus are we running behind on any deadlines or are the staff feeling like they're doing a lot more work or making decisions that are not in alignment with those um, with their individual responsibility. Secondly, then we will formalize like those feedback loops. So create like that early problem detection through those meetings, reviews, check-ins, one-on-one, emails, and communication. And third, we would monitor burnout indicators structurally. So we don't wait for like those someone to say, hey, I'm burning out or I'm tired or I'm not able to support with this task. We ensure that we're doing those things along the way and measure any decision bottlenecks or role ambiguities that may exist. And also, again, redistribute that workload as best as possible. Says these are the leading indicators of burnout that you can intervene on before people are exhausted. So I know we have about an hour, but I wanted to give also like 10, 15 minutes for any discussion or feedback from those attending. And um, I also wanted to share the three key takeaways from this presentation, being that burnout is often predictable when systems are unclear. But if you can diagnose those structural problems or bring someone on that can support in that process, you can help support and prevent that. Um, and it's all about creating that organizational culture where employees, leaders, and anyone, no matter the level, can feel like they can have those open conversations about maybe, hey, let's slow down on this, or changing different support systems, or even implementing um, those structural supports to ensure that the organization is moving successfully. And growth without governance creates risk, um, specifically in leadership. So we must include that structural competence and understanding that technical expertise alone isn't going to be enough. We have to be in touch with those um, basically capacity and role clarity. Um, as you think about your own program, it's important to ask yourself what structural adjustment could improve sustainability within the next 30 days. And that should be then in your next action. So it could be something as, let's say, simple as doing a Friday meeting or a Monday morning checking in with everyone, or even just sending an email where you have like an open door policy with like, hey, let's check out how's your program going beyond the surface level, right? Because you're gonna hear, oh, everything's fine, everything's well, we're on track to meet that deadline or that task requirement. Um, just having those more open conversations about so that anything that's unclear um, can be clarified. And Maria, thank you for your time today. If you're ready to build a sustainable leadership in your program, I do offer free ways to work together um, through advisory consultations, strategic guidance, and structural alignment audits to help diagnose your current organizational health and ongoing leadership development partnerships for teams committed to long-term transformation. And I look forward to helping you build programs that last. Thank you, Alicia.
I was